Welcome, everybody. Welcome to PCA's Morning Coffee Series. I'm Vanessa Bertozzi. I work at Partners for Climate Action, and I'll be facilitating this morning coffee series. At PCA, we look to foster meaningful ecological restoration and climate action within the bioregion of the Hudson Valley estuary of the watershed. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the concept of a bioregion, it's basically an area that's defined by the characteristics of the natural environment, rather than by the sort of arbitrary human-made boundaries of municipalities, and county borders. And at PCA, our work is through grant making, through technical support, through various ways that we really try to support the nonprofits and tax exempt entities that we work with, such as municipalities, community organizations, and we also offer various programs and educational offerings, such as this morning coffee series. And this is all made possible through donations, so please, if you'd like to contribute, we would really appreciate that. Some logistics. This program is being recorded, and we will share it out with you after today. Will be posted on our YouTube and our website. We ask that you please mute yourself and feel free to submit questions during the talk, and if you see somebody else's question in the chat that you like, give it a thumbs up, so we can kind of see what most folks are interested in, and we'll prioritize those. So today's topic is natural burial. And PCA's work, as I mentioned, is focused on ecological repair and climate action. And through that, we want people to experience just how humans are a part of natural systems. And we believe this sense of reconnection is so profound. And we share this in common with today's guest, Suzanne Kelly. Suzanne Kelly, PhD, is a farmer, a writer, and a longtime green burial advocate whose book that came out in 2015 called Greening Death, Reclaiming Burial Practices and Restoring Our Tie to the Earth, whose book explores the burgeoning green burial movement in the United States and its promise of honoring decay as a form of interconnectedness and its potential to actively restore our relationship to the land. A recipient of the Green Burial Council's 2015 Leadership Award, she's been recognized for her demonstrated foresight, innovation, extraordinary commitment to the environment through sustainability and attainability in the area of human death care practices. In 2009, she chaired the committee to initially form the natural burial ground for the town of Rhinebeck, for the cemetery there, the traditional cemetery. And the natural burial ground opened in 2014. She continues to steward the natural burial ground as the cemetery's part-time administrator while also owning and operating Green Owl Farm, a sustainable no-till market garden just down the road from the burial ground. Today, Suzanne will introduce what green burial is and walk us through how the green burial site in Rhinebeck got started, and she'll talk about the broader movement towards green burial more broadly and how it could resonate here in the Hudson Valley. We think there's potential there, right? Because here people are so connected to this place, and our respect for the natural world here in the Hudson Valley runs so deep. So I'm very excited to welcome Suzanne Kelly. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Suzanne.
Thank you. Thanks, Vanessa. So I'm excited to be here. I'm especially excited to be here because the town of Rhinebeck Cemetery received a lovely grant for this year, the year we're still in, through Partners for Climate Action for the Natural Burial Ground, and I can talk more about that in a little bit. So I have a series of slides I'm going to take you through. But first, I'm just going to do sort of a green burial 101, just so we're kind of all in the same place before I move through some of these images. So green burial is also known, as I say here, as natural burial. We call our green burial ground in Rhinebeck a natural burial ground because we just voted that that was what we wanted to go with. Some folks on the committee, when we started talking about it in 2009, were worried about, the word green being, a sort of a greenwashed word, right? And people worried about being greenwashed. I'm sort of in favor of the green burial term. Green is it evokes sort of nature, growth, and life. There is a long lineage, mythologically and historically of green having that sort of capacity and capability. And it always makes me sad that the market has kind of like attached itself to it. But nonetheless, we've gone with natural, and the two terms are interchangeable. Green burial, at its most basic form, is a way of caring for the dead with minimal impact to the environment. What that means is whole body earth burial it's usually described in terms of what it's not, without the use of the trilogy of practices that have come to make up the American way of death, which includes chemical embalming, the modern casket, which is usually made out of some kind of treated hardwoods and metals, and the burial vault, which is in some ways is probably the worst offender to the land. It's usually made up of reinforced concrete, which includes, sometimes some kind of asphalt that we know includes, some petroleum, includes some metal. Sometimes it's made out of titanium. Sometimes it's made out of plastic. And that's what, if you don't know, what the casket goes inside of in most cemeteries in the U.S. So that when the body decays and the box decays, there won't be that kind of subsidence, and you won't have a divot in the ground, and they won't have to fill it back in. So that's why vaults are primarily used in the U.S. So green burial is a way of caring for the dead without those three things. And so what it basically means is the body goes in the ground, ideally somewhere between 3.5 and 4 feet. You don't really want to go deeper than 4 feet because the active microbial activity does not exist that low. And all the soil that's taken out of the hole is then placed back in the hole, and usually, though not in every single green burial ground, is mounded back up to settle over time. The body, as I'll show you in some of these images, is placed in some kind of plant-based and biodegradable container. So it can be a shroud, it can be an untreated wooden box, so long as it's wooden doweled. It can be, wicker, willow, seagrass, macrame, you get the idea, paper mache. So that's sort of what green burial is at its most basic. But green burial has further goals, and you can see some of those goals as they've taken shape in the natural burial ground in our cemetery and in some other natural burial grounds throughout the U.S. Right now, there are about a little over 400 green burial grounds in the U.S. The movement started in, I'll show you this if you can go. I'll show you that in a second. But it started in 1998 in Ramsey Creek Preserve in Westminster, South Carolina. And so it's been, 25 years, a little over 25 years that the movement has kind of taken shape in the U.S. And we still only have over about 400. And of those 400, those that have further aims are few. That is further aims than just burying the body in the way that I just described. Can you go to the second image? Okay, so this really describes some of those further aims as it's kind of been articulated by the Green Burial Council. The Green Burial Council is a not-for-profit certifying organization, much like the Green Building Council is for LEED certified buildings. And this is voluntary certification, and they have a 3-tier system. The natural burial ground at the town of Rhinebeck is at the 2nd tier. And that 2nd tier, as they've described it here, is called natural. At the 1st tier, you've got the hybrid natural burial grounds or green burial grounds that are the majority of them. And they're doing what I just described. They're burying the body in that way with not really any care for what's happening above ground, right? So you can still have upright stones. You can still use pesticides on your lawn. You can still, mow and do all the stuff above ground and without sort of any conservation, preservation, or restoration of the land. So you could, in fact, we do this even in Rhinebeck, in our conventional part of the cemetery. We allow essentially green burial, a vaultless burial in a biodegradable container without embalming it anywhere in the cemetery. So that's what the hybrid model more or less looks like, and those are the majority of them. The second tier is natural, and that's what we are. So it's a separate parcel of land that's dedicated to green burial. And you also need to make a commitment to some conservation, preservation, and restoration. These burial grounds can be any size. Ours is around 10 acres. And they don't need to be connected with any kind of conservation organization like the next tier I'm going to talk about. But you do need to have a deed restriction that runs with the land that says that this parcel has been set aside for this kind of burial, and it can't revert back to the kind of conventional burial that I was talking about. The third tier is conservation burial, and there are very few of them, fewer than 20 in the US right now. And those parcels are much larger. So, for example, an example would be like a 20-acre green burial ground that's dedicated to green burial, where they're using the proceeds of burial to care for a much larger swath of land, say like 1,000 acres. So conservation burial is essentially about turning burial on its head. It's say we're not using upland. We're actually using the fact of human burial, of human death, to care for the land in perpetuity. Our green burial ground in Rhinebeck is too small to be a conservation burial ground. You need to be at least 20 acres to be certified by the Green Burial Council. And we're also a municipal cemetery and not connected with any kind of conservation organization that is caring for the land in perpetuity. The municipality is doing it itself. But I can talk more about what we're doing in Rhinebeck to kind of like connect ourselves to some of those conservation burial ground principles in a bit. So you can go to the next slide. So this is the first green burial ground that I mentioned that opened in Westminster, South Carolina in 1998. Before that time, there were as I said, no green burial grounds. There was no green burial movement in the U.S. There was a woodland, what they call woodland burial in the U.K. Happening in the 90s, right before this, and so this sort of came on the heels of that. But for a long time, Ramsey Creek, I would say, for the first decade or so, was one of a handful of green burial grounds that existed in the U.S. Okay, you can go to the next one. So this is a shrouded burial. For some folks, it can be quite jarring to see a shrouded body as they've never seen one. I would say more than half of the burials that we have in Rhinebeck are shrouded burials. People don't opt for boxes. Shrouds can be, people don't need to buy anything. You can use your own. We've had people buried in their own blankets. It can be, something that you give the funeral director, though many times people will purchase something. Go to the next one. This is another example of a shrouded burial. This is a green burial ground. Actually, this is a green burial ground in not conservation. It's actually a mid-tier natural like ours in the state of Washington. And this what is it called? The carriage that it's on, the hand-pulled carriage that it's on, we have one of those as well. It's actually the same one. It's handmade. And this is one of the things that I think makes natural burial in particular really quite moving and important to people, because there's a lot of family participation that we allow that isn't necessarily allowed in conventional burials. So in our natural burial ground, we only allow foot traffic, except if people can't get down, we'll take them down by car. And so the body is drawn down on this carriage, on this cart, very slowly. And the kind of slow pace of the pulling of the cart really sets the stage for the pace of the burial, which often these burials can go on for much longer as they're much more family directed. Go to the next one. This is actually in our natural burial ground. So this is actually a bamboo casket, and you can see the setup of the of the burial. All the soil that's taken out of the hole is placed next to the hole, which is not typical in most cemeteries throughout the US. The soil is kind of seen as, in most burials, seen as something that we're not supposed to look at, and is usually carted away and then brought back for the burial. This pile of soil is, I would say, in 80% of the cases, at least in our natural burial ground, filled back in by family and friends who are there. People usually want to participate, and that's one of the reasons why the burials often can go on for much longer. You can see that the casket is on these boards, and the family can also help lower with hand straps the body into the grave. So, like I said, there's a lot of hands-on action. You can go to the next one. This is a conservation burial ground in South Central Washington State that's doing what I described before. It's about 20 or 25 acres of burial area where they are actively conserving over 1,000 acres of land, in part by they do other kinds of conservation work, but green burial is also one of the pieces of that conservation work. And a lot of the areas where they bury folks, they can only access by foot. And sometimes they even have to bring horses in to do that. So that's why I like this photo. Go to the next one. This is another conservation burial ground in Wilmot, Ohio. They're protecting several hundred acres of land. And you can see by these photos that, you know, the ecology and the landscape of these conservation burial grounds differ quite a lot. A lot of this is open prairie, so they're doing a lot of prairie conservation at Foxfield, unlike the one that I just showed you in South Central Washington, where it's mostly woodland. You can see on the top, this is actually the pile of soil, but there's what we call biomass laid on top of the soil, sticks and twigs and leaves and flowers or whatever seasonal at the time, branches. We do the same thing at our natural burial ground. All of that is laid on top of the body before we place the soil back in to encourage swift decomposition. You can go to the next one. This is a certified natural, where we are at that tier burial ground in Texas, again, all over the US. This is also a burial ground that allows the interment of pets with people, which we don't allow in our burial ground. And I like this photo because it shows just what I was describing, the ways in which family are actively participating in caring for the dead. You can go to the next one. Same with this one. This one's really lovely too, because if you can see, there's a lot of handwriting on the wood on the casket, and so very often, and this is not true for every family, but we see definitely a crossover between the home funeral movement and the whoops, I just lost you. Oh, well, wherever you are, I don't know. Oh, there you are. The home funeral movement and the green burial movement, where many families are actively caring for the dead in the home before this part happens that I'm actively involved with, and all of that took place with the casket, where people were writing on the casket, happened in that space. Go to the next one. This is an example of that. Right, so there's sort of that kind of like all that fear and terror around death is sort of kind of embraced with the family participating in all these activities that many times I find at the natural burial ground, especially even with the lowering and the filling in back in of the grave, people initially don't want to do it. They think, oh, we're not going to stick around for that. And then once given the opportunity, they all end up participating. And I cannot tell you, still, like I get so many letters and emails and just people coming up to me, you know, even now years later, talking about what a meaningful experience it was to be in those woods and to actively, you know, render their dead to the earth. Go to the next one. And this is a photo of the body inside the grave. You can see that the hole is it's really not that deep. So as I said, it's about 3.5 to 4 feet. Go to the next. This is a conservation burial ground in Florida. So again, all over the US. They, again, are doing different kinds of conservation work. They also, I think maybe the next slide shows the planting of a tree. I'm not sure if no, it doesn't. Well, I'll talk about that in a minute. But anyway, they also plant trees. I'll talk about our tree planting policy in a minute. But so yeah, so they do some tree planting. You can see that in this case, often the mound is the memorial, like in the next slide. You see, go to the next slide. Yeah, so this was the conservation burial ground that I mentioned before in South Central Washington. And this guy they actually created this conservation burial ground because the head of the conservation organization that already existed suddenly died. And he'd always said he wanted to be buried on the land. And when they looked into how to do it, they realized they had to start a cemetery. And so that's how they came to start doing sort of public green burial on the land. But one of the reasons why I like this photo is because it shows how the mound often becomes the memorial in these green burial grounds, especially in many of the conservation burial grounds where the burial density is lower, unlike how it is at our natural burial ground in Rhinebeck. So the burials are spread much farther apart. So the kind of memorialization, we're so used to having like a headstone, a marker, and we do allow markers. I'll show you some of those in a minute in our natural burial ground. But some conservation burial grounds do not allow that and instead opt for something sort of more natural, like in this example. Go to the next one.
You can't hear this, can you?
You're what? You're Zoom meeting?
Oh, folks, please mute yourselves if you can.
This is actually in our natural burial ground. I mentioned that we do allow markers. So we're very strict on the size of the markers. They have to be indigenous stones to the Hudson Valley. They cannot be machine cut or polished. They can be engraved. And we used to just lay them on top of the grave, but now we've actually started setting them. These will sink over time because there is no foundation on them. But we do feel like it's important to allow folks to memorialize in some way. Go to the next one. This is another example. You can see it sort of set in, and then it eventually gets covered over by grass. This is at a burial ground near Ithaca, New York. Go to the next. And this is what I was talking about with the tree. So this is the conservation burial ground in Florida. Everybody wants to plant a tree. This is true in our burial ground as well. I cannot tell you how many people want to plant a tree on top of their mound. But we are in control. We need to be in control of how we're caring for and stewarding the woods. And so we don't permit folks to plant trees or anything anywhere in the natural burial ground. And so we're pretty ruthless about it. You know, daily the groundskeepers are down there. You know, people will go down. Right now people are planting mums. And so we're constantly pulling things out. The problem is that when you sell a plot to somebody, they're the ones that know the rules and regulations, and then they die, and then their families are the ones that are visiting, and they don't really understand what the rules are. So there has to be a kind of hypervigilance on our part to make sure that nothing is taking root and nothing stays, and that we have control over what's going in the ground. We are actively planting trees, but if everybody planted a tree on top of their mound, we would have too high density of trees. It would just be not good for the woods. Go on to the next one. And this is us planting trees some years back. When we first started the natural burial ground, it's a young hardwood forest that had grown up probably in the 1940s from some kind of pasture land that was adjacent to Grassmere. It was part of the Grassmere estate initially. And some of you may be familiar with where that is in Rhinebeck. And so a lot of the trees are tall and spindly. And when we went in to set up the survey for natural burial, you know, we realized that woods that's on the back end of part of the cemetery had really just been used for a woodlot. So there was kind of a natural, kind of a makeshift trail that had gone through, which we ended up making the carriage trail, more or less the shape of the carriage trail that went through. But it also meant that because it was this young hardwood forest with a lot of deer grazing, just like everywhere else, that we were going to need to get rid of a lot of trees, a lot of invasive trees, a lot of dangerous trees, and a lot of dead trees. So we did that, and we took down hundreds of trees. and had still left a pretty dense forested area. And since then, since that time, the last 10 years or so, we have been actively planting trees with through the advice of Hudsonia, who gave us 2 biological assessments before we started. One when we started and one the year later, and then also with recommendations from the DEC. So we've been guided by those for most of our tree plantings, and also by Meg Crawford, who heads up the Village Tree Commission. She's our the Rhinebeck Village Tree Commission. She is our advisor to most of the plantings that we do in the burial ground, and actually throughout the entire cemetery. You can go to the next one. Oh, that's the last one. So I wanted to say, because I didn't say this at the beginning, just very quickly, why green burial? I guess maybe it's obvious to you folks who are here because of the pollution, but for a long time, cremation was seen as the best alternative to conventional burial, and cremation, while cremation is better than the trilogy of practices, environmentally that I mentioned at the beginning, it still poses a threat to water, soil, and air. Anytime you burn something, you're spewing dioxins and furans and mercury from well, not anything, but a body in this case, mercury from dental fillings potentially into the air. And so there have been efforts to try, not so much in the US, to create better filters on our crematories, so that for those folks, for religious reasons or for whatever reasons, who want to be burned, it's more environmentally sound. But currently, burning is not as environmentally sound than putting a whole body in the ground and letting it decay on its own. So a lot of the folks who end up choosing green burial, I find, are people that are pulled over sort of from the cremation crowd. However, this doesn't mean that we don't permit the burial of cremation ashes in our natural burial ground. We do, and I would say that I think almost all green and even at the conservation level, burial grounds in the U.S. do also offer cremation burial. In our burial ground, I would say about a third of the plots are cremation burials plots, because they're sited too close to trees where we can't get a whole body in. So the cremation burials in many ways help to lower the density of full burials that are in there, while also providing revenue for the town and giving people options that they still want. So I think I'd love to just answer folks' questions at this point, and that's it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Suzanne. It's really such a paradigm shift. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that. Like, um, it seems like green burial is very new and still pretty rare in the United States. So are you often interacting with folks who are just not familiar with it? And can you talk a bit about how that process goes for those families?
Yeah, I mean, green burial is not new, right? This is the way we buried our dead over 150 years ago, right? This was even in the old part of our cemetery, where we do have upright stones as large as obelisks. You can see that there are divots all throughout the historic part of the cemetery, because the body was placed in some kind of natural container, likely unembalmed. However, and I don't have time to go into the whole history of how we ended up here. However, since that time, we have kind of lost that memory, right? And so there is, and this is one of the things I talk specifically about, that's a thread through my book, that as we kind of lost that memory, we also forgot that the dead body is not this dangerous thing that we need to be running away from, right? So the dead body for a long time is seen as a contaminant. And so I think that for many folks, the big question that I get from people is, wow, you can just put a body in the ground like that? It doesn't have to be inside something? So I would say that the dead body is a contaminant. The dead body is something that we need to guard ourselves from or against. Is I would say the prevailing thing that people need the hurdle that people need to get past. But once people get past that, most people are sold on it pretty quickly. Like, they often say, oh, I wondered why we can't do that anymore, or it never made any sense to me why. So I find I don't need to there's not a lot of hard selling on my side. It's something that, even as I say in my book, that really just makes sense to people, right? It's some kind of almost like internal wisdom that, like, this is the way it's supposed to be done. And by the way, it's the way it's done throughout most of the world still for those folks who bury. Yeah.
Um, and then I also want to just ask you, like, how did you come to this? What's the motivation behind your work?
Yeah, so there was kind of a collision of two things. One, I was in graduate school, working on my PhD. This was in 2000, at the crossroads of the environment, gender. I ended up teaching women's studies for over a decade at New Paltz. And right at that time, my father died suddenly. And so I was, it was the first close death I mean, I'd experienced lots of deaths in my family because I was from on one side, this large Catholic family. So I'd gone to a lot of funerals as a kid. But in terms of a primary death, it was the first one. And because I was enmeshed in thinking about the environment and women's bodies as sort of both playground and dump, right, as sort of this other thing, I switched that thinking, I sort of to position that thinking over to the dead body. And then that took me on this journey that I've sort of never left. Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah.
Well, I'd love to give you some questions from our crowd. Um, what systemic barriers will we have to overcome in New York to operationalize human composting, or NOR? And what would you recommend for someone interested in making this option available locally in conjunction with natural burial sites?
Well, it is legal in New York State currently. It was passed, I think, I've lost track now. It was either last year or the year before. So human composting is legal. In New York State, however, the way that they lobbied for it to get the bill passed, which I was not in favor of, was that that these facilities have to be on the back end of a cemetery. So every crematory in New York State is on the back end of a cemetery. Only a cemetery can open up a crematory, and now only a cemetery can open up one of these composting facilities. In other states, like in Washington State, for instance, anyone can do it, right? So if you're entrepreneurial and you think you're into death care practices, and you can get the funds together and you know how to operate, you decide you know how to operate, you can do it. And so I do worry. I mean, one of the things about crematories that I find to be problematic, unless you're part of a cremation society, is that nobody goes to the crematory. Nobody goes to I mean, I've been to a crematory, but like nobody goes with their dead person typically to the crematory. They go to the cemetery, but they don't go to the crematory. And one of the thing about human composting, when it was first kind of brought to the fore by Katrina Spade, which then was called the Urban Death Project, was this ecological part was key. But again, this familial part was also key. And it's the same thing with green burial, as I kind of tried to mention right through my talk, that these things go hand in hand. So it's not just about rendering the dead into compost. It's about allowing the loving inner circle to participate in that process. And I do worry if they're piggybacked onto these cemeteries that we're going to lose sight of that, as we have with crematories.
Okay. And to follow up on that, a question from Laura Anderson. She says, I've heard about soil amendments being used with the burial of cremated remains, and you mentioned adding plant material to support decomposition in green burial. Would adding soil amendments also support decomposition in green burial? Is there any negative impact on the nearby environment as the body decomposed, especially the bones? I know cremated remains can be toxic to plants.
Yeah. So I do encourage folks who I always say plant, who bury their cremated remains. I always say plant who bury their cremated remains, to maybe bring a little bit of compost. This is not an option for a lot of people, so it's not a rule that we have. But I do, suggest it to people if it's something that they can do. They can be toxic to plant life, especially if you're just like putting them on tops of plants. That's why scattering in forests, et cetera, is, especially in an area where lots of people do it, not a great idea. The phosphate that we put in when we plant trees, is the same. A lot of that's in bones also. So, bone meal, et cetera, can be actually really helpful for plant growth. So some of it is good. Too much of it is bad. It's like anything. We don't encourage any kind of soil amendments in burial. And it's one of the reasons why we're not in favor of the mushroom suit at our natural burial ground, which is something that was first presented as an art project, art project's probably a diminishing way to describe it, but She was a performance artist, I believe, who first brought it forward. And then, the market picked up on it and created this mushroom soup. But it was predicated on the idea that somehow the dead body couldn't decay on its own and that it was somehow contaminated and that these mushrooms could sort of cleanse it of its filth. So I kind of see it as a little bit sort of antithetical to the whole green burial movement. We're kind of trying to say that the dead body is not a dangerous contaminant in and of itself. It can be if it's got like Ebola or, mad cow disease. There are diseases that don't leave the body, but by and large, the dead body is not a dangerous contaminant. Most of the pathogens die with the body. So, and the decay of the body is not problematic to the soil typically. So we don't really encourage amendments. Again, we do put the biomass in because the really key thing is we want swift decomposition. We want the body to decay, the majority of the body, not the bones, they're going to take longer, to go away and to reabsorb in the surrounding area as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you said that, just to follow up on that, are there actual ecological benefits to the body decomposing in the soil? Like, is it actually?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I don't know that I can really answer that. I mean, I think generally I would say yes, because decomposition, right, is life, right? So anything that's decomposing is going to add something back. I mean, this is the promise that most people who choose green burial sort of hang their hat on. They're like, I'm going to be giving back to this tree. I'm going to be giving back. And there definitely is a giving back. What that exact giving back is, I'm just not the right person to ask. There are folks that study this. There are 7 body farms in the U.S. that could probably better tell you, what they have found, especially with, I'm sure they've been studying green burial at least within the last 10 years more carefully. And they might have some better findings on that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, here's a couple questions from Laura Hoffman. How long will an individual's burial site remain undisturbed, and how is this being managed? I've been to Rosendale, New York, and Greenwood in Brooklyn, where there seem to be no markers. And then second question, there used to be the idea that green burial sites may pollute the nearby aquifer. And is there current thinking on this?
Yeah. So, in the 1830s, there was this kind of fear of contamination, as I mentioned to you, right? That the dead body was a contaminant, and for good reason, because there was a lot of disease like yellow fever, et cetera, that was in cholera that were running rampant. And most towns, and Rhinebeck was one of them, started to place bans on burials within the city limits. So they got rid of all the church graveyards. That's how the Rhinebeck Cemetery ended up on the hill, and that's why we ended up with these rural cemeteries that were sited high. Having said that, however, the fear of the body as a contaminant is not what we once thought it was. However, you do want to, when cemeteries are sited, you do want to make sure that they're not too close to a body of water. This is true even, at a farm, right? You don't want things like in massive amounts running downstream into the water. So our cemetery is cited as such. This is true even if you bury in your backyard, which is legal, in some places if you wanted to look into that. Not that you would necessarily want to do it, but they're sort of the same rules. They got to be a certain distance from the road, a certain distance from power lines, a certain distance from property lines, and a certain distance from water, right? So you don't want to bury right on the bank of a stream. Yeah.
Okay. And then to this idea of how long are the individual burial sites being managed?
Yeah,
Like,
I'm not sure.
you
What is that?
mentioned how there's a natural stone, very beautiful, but it kind of sinks in, becomes covered with grass. Like, how do you
Right.
go and find your ancestors' burial site, or is that the wrong way to think about it?
Well, there's 2 ways. One is there's records. So every burial is recorded in our cemetery and should be, I'm assuming, at every other cemetery. This is certainly true at Greenwood, and I'm guessing at Rosendale. So, you have to think about it like there are a lot of unmarked graves in the Rhinebeck Cemetery, just in the regular part of the cemetery. Tons of them, right? So there may be unmarked graves in the natural burial ground, either by way of the stone eventually sinking in 50, 60, 70 years and not being easily uncovered, or just by not having any marker at all. We do have a staff though, right? So we're actively caring for every grave in the cemetery. And for our part anyway, for any stone that looks like it's sinking, we are lifting it up. We are lucky that we have a municipal model and we have an active staff at a place like Rosendale, where it's not for profit. They're really low on funds. You can kind of tell even by looking at it, that it's they could use some help. They could use, you know, some help. Yeah, some probably groundskeeping help. Yep. But anyway, forever. The great model, the great thing about the town of Rhinebeck is that it's in perpetuity. It is a municipality. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Um, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about the conservation
Yeah.
burial idea. And just curious, this is from Kate Maynard. Why are there only 20 or so in the US? Like what do you think are the opportunities and maybe what are the challenges? And I also wanted to mention, I think HK is on HK Lee. Hi, if you want to introduce yourself and maybe say what, because I believe you're pursuing a conservation burial in Hudson Valley, right?
Yes, I am. Thank you so much, Vanessa. And Suzanne, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for your talk. I have absorbed your book, over a very short period of time. And thank you for this opportunity to speak to this group. But I am, you know, following the path that Suzanne has chartered in the Hudson Valley in trying to start one or possibly multiple conservation cemeteries in the area. It's a special place, as Suzanne mentioned, and as you all know, as it relates to the connection of the population to the land and the beauty, the arts, the history, and um, and it's taken some time and it continues to be on this trajectory of more and more people coming to natural burial as an option. And we believe that that there's an ability for more people to kind of support and help grow this concept in this area. So yeah, why aren't there more? It's hard. We're organized as a nonprofit. You need to get on board, obviously, lands or other kind of governing bodies that provide conservation easements. You need to get on board benefactors as well as communities. Your very stringent laws that Suzanne kind of touched upon a little bit in starting any new cemetery. And so there's a lot needs to come together and it takes time. And unfortunately, there aren't a ton of people that can afford quite to be able to go through all of that. So we have a small team. We're called Eon Woods that are working with a meeting, talking in the kind of like the mid Hudson Valley area to try to get one started.
Yes.
So Aeon Woods is you started by creating a nonprofit, you have board of directors, and at this
And
point you're
yes,
looking for land, is that it? You're looking for land that could act, it has to be over 20 acres, I think as Suzanne mentioned, right?
correct. So we've been doing so the state limits the amount of land that a cemetery entity can own. So it's limited at 200 on the top end. At a minimum, it needs to be 50. However, realistically, if you think about the distance from a water well, the aquifer, the borders, all of the safety and just kind of um, rules that are in place, 20, you kind of eat into that 20 really quickly. And so we're looking probably 40 to 200. And if we're kind of at the lower end, we're talking about potentially multiple sites, perhaps kind of throughout the community. But yeah, so we're actively looking for land and we're speaking with land trusts to try to get them on board as well.
Great. And how
That's
can folks follow and support your work, HK, if we want to see a conservation burial here in the Hudson Valley?
Well, thank you for that prompt. I will put our website on the chat in the chat, and then you can follow us there, and you can, reach me directly, hk@eonwoods.org. Um,
And we'll share out your link when we follow up with the recording of this as well.
Amazing. Thank you.
Suzanne, did you have a question for HK or a comment?
No, I was just going to say, I think getting land trusts on board is hard. It's a really, really struggle. That's something that I had hoped to, before I became involved in this project in Rhinebeck, to hope to do, years ago. And I talking to all the land trusts in the area, and honestly, at that time, like, they looked at me like I had 10 heads, like,
Mm.
and but it is true that most of them just don't want to get into the burial business. And so most of the conservation burial grounds that have grown up have grown out of some kind of conservation organization. Some of them piggybacked later on with a land trust, but they were a conservation organization to begin with. And so in some ways, it's probably an easier way to get to it if you can start that way, be your own conservation organization. So you don't have to do that part. You still have to raise the money and do everything else, which is its own other barriers. But the conservation part, that part will be taken care of.
Yeah, could we maybe even talk about like the money side of this? Like, how much does a green burial cost versus for a family versus a traditional or cremation? And then how do those fees then play into, does that go to Rhinebeck town? Does it go to stewarding the lands of the natural burial, or what's the kind of financials behind it?
Well, in Rhinebeck, we have a three-tiered, we've just changed the fee structure. So now there's a Rhinebeck rate, a tri-county rate, and everybody outside of that. Before we started the natural burial ground, I mean, we sell probably, for every one plot we sell in the conventional section, we probably sell 8 plots in the natural burial ground.
Wow.
Yeah, we sell a lot of, there's a lot of interest because there just aren't any natural burial grounds here. And what that means is that we have people from all over buying plots in Rhinebeck that wouldn't otherwise be buried here. Many from New York City, New Jersey, surrounding states. Well, Vermont has a natural burial ground just recently, but we had a lot from Vermont for a while, Connecticut, but even just far afield in New York, further south. So the fee structure now is it's $1,650 for a Rhinebeck resident to purchase a plot. The plot is 5 by 10. In the conventional section, the plots are slightly smaller, and so they're $1,250 because they're smaller. And then the price is double so if you're in Columbia, Ulster, and Dutchess, it's $3,300, and then it doubles again if you're outside of there. But we've raised the prices for people out. Nobody's blinked, especially for like the folks from New York City. I mean, I hate to say it, but like there has been I mean, you can get a plot in Rosendale for a fraction of the price. And for people who really can't afford it are going there to get them. But our burial grounds is just, well, it's just nicer. I mean, we're caring for the land in a better way. We have more money. We have more support. We have a not-for-profit, Friends of Rhinebeck Cemetery, that I helped establish in 2013. There's just a lot more vision and money and support and staff to take care of this burial ground to make it nicer. So, but anyway, yeah, so that's what we're doing. We want to make sure that it's still affordable for people in the community. But, once you buy a plot, there are no other upkeep fees. So this is the only money we ever get out of anyone, and then we'll have to care for the cemetery forever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the money goes back into
Our money goes into the general fund. It goes into the general fund.
Okay.
Yep. And then we have a budget every year, just like the highway does. And yeah, but you know what? I think, we're one of the few, we make, we make our budget, I think, more or less every year these days because we're selling a lot of plots. Unlike, other arms of the municipality that don't have any way to bring in money.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then with the conservation burial, the model is sort of, there's money coming in associated with the burials, but then there's this larger expanse of land to
Exactly.
maintain and manage. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Usually these that's why I think the successful ones are conservation organizations, because their work is conservation work. Their work is not strictly burial. Like the burial is one piece of the larger vision, which is really to care for this larger swath of land. I mean, I think that is ultimately the conservation vision. The conservation burial ground vision is not like we're doing green burial. We're using green burial as one thing to care for this larger piece of land. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you know of any other, maybe talk a little bit about the green burial community. And or do you know of other resources that folks could look at if they're interested in this world?
Yeah, well, Green Burial Council, I would say, is the first place I would look, right? So they're the only organization they're the kind of the gold standard for green burial, certified either burial grounds. They even certify funeral directors and products as well. And by products, I mean like caskets, which is kind of important. Like for instance, willow caskets. Most of them are made in China. Some of them are. There's not a lot of willow grown here. There's a collective of women willow growers that's forming in the U.S. right now. There's one, actually. She was a former student of mine who's making willow caskets across the river. But anyway, so knowing where you're getting your burial containers, if you're not making it yourself, is important. So anyway, the Green Burial Council. The Home Funeral Association is also kind of useful because there's that kind of, like I said, there's this crossover between the two. So I guess those two spaces.
Okay. And yeah, and I've just noticed that there's a little bit of a resurgence in interests around death practices
Yeah.
in the Hudson Valley, and I was wondering if you are familiar with that, if you could speak to that a little bit in the
Yeah.
section.
Yeah, there are quite a few groups. There's a 7 Cents group. I've given talks with them. They're over in Milan. There's a, I was trained through hospice as a death doula, and though I'm not doing any death doula work, but there are there's just like, they're around. I mean, people contact me all the time, but there's definitely a lot of death doulas in the area. There's 7 Cents is one of them. They're doing a lot of death education and death doula work. There's Circle Home for the Dying in Kingston. They've been around a long time, which was kind of like an offshoot of hospice. There were some hospice folks that created this Home for the Dying in Kingston, and they do a lot of educational work. They're not for profit. There's a Death Cafe, which I do believe is still held locally, where people get together and have cake and drink coffee and talk about death-related topics. It's a national movement, but I do think there's one at the Rhinebeck Library, or there was.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
interesting.
Mm-hmm.
For a little bit more of a nuts and bolts question
Yeah.
from Karen Smythe. Hi, Karen, Mayor of Red Hook Village. What do you do when you run out of space?
Yeah, I know. It's a good
Yeah.
question. The truth is that like we're probably, we have another section we're going to open up, and if we go at this rate, we're probably 60 years out for the natural burial. Not for the conventional. Still a lot of space. Not because we have more space, just because the plots aren't selling as fast. That's why I'm really hoping that there'll be more. I mean, I'm just hoping in general because I want the green burial movement to grow, and I'm really excited about what HK is doing because more green burial, please. But also to absorb some of what's happening on our end. I would love to see, regionally more green burial grounds open. So once you run out of space, you just care for the woods in perpetuity. That's what you do. There are green burial grounds. One in the U.S. that actually recycles graves. It's in Virginia. We are not doing that, and I highly doubt that the town of Rhinebeck would be interested in doing that. In part because you do have to deal with the bones, right? So if you're going to dig up a grave, even in the case of the one in Virginia, after 75 years, most likely the bones are gone. But they do this in parts of Europe, and they take out the bones and they put them in a common area, and then they sell the grave again.
Wow.
It is an option for green burial grounds. It's just not something that we're doing.
And again, how many acres? You have 10 acres right now?
It's about 10 acres, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's a section of it that we're not planning to bury in. So that's about 60 years without that section. I'll be long gone by then. Maybe they'll want to, use up that other section. But we're trying to do conservation work in that one area that we can't do in the burial areas.
Mm-hmm. Maybe tell us a little bit more about the conservation goals of the Rhinebeck burial ground. And there was also a question about the introduction of non-native species, or like you had mentioned before, you don't allow the families to plant anything, but tell us more about what you need to do on the land. Like, what are your conservation goals?
So it's different for the burial areas than it is for the non-burial areas. And the main reason for that is because we are always trying to strike this balance between wild and accessible. And so, for instance, if you've been to the Natural Burial Ground in Rhinebeck, you would know that there is a gravel carriage trail that's about 8 foot wide that takes you around in a horseshoe shape. You get to the bottom and all the burials are on the right side of the trail. There's nothing on the left. The first few years, we did not have that gravel carriage trail. I was insistent we not have the gravel carriage trail. And then we had our first March burial, and it was a disaster. The family was fine. I was not fine. But anyway, I was convinced, and we had the highway put it in for us. I mean, this is one of the beautiful things about being a municipality. So the highway did a great job putting it in, and it's naturalized and it looks really lovely. And it's been really helpful because people in wheelchairs can more easily get down. They can get fairly close to the burial areas if they don't want to go right into the burial area. It's just overall been a good thing. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that, like I said, we have these 2 biological assessments from Hudsonia, 2 from Hudsonia and 1 from the DEC. And then we have guidance from Meg Crawford. And so we're strictly focused on biodiversity. We're not strictly focused on native plants. However, we are heavy on native plants. Thus the native grant that we received from PCA this year. It was a $25,000 grant that we're just about done with. It was focused on native shrubs and perennials in the corridor that leads from, I showed that first photo where the gate was, from where the gate is straight down the corridor to where the burial area starts. And then on the left is what's designated on our map as a common area where we're doing more perennial plantings. So we are heavy on the natives. But we're not strictly doing natives. If you look at the front, when you first enter the natural burial ground on the right-hand side where the sign is, that was our first effort of getting rid of stiltgrass area. And we did a lot of natives in there, but we did some non-natives as well. So if any of you know Meg Crawford, she's not strictly focused on natives. Most of her education around managing and being resilient to climate change is about biodiversity and not strictly natives. So so we're in keeping with that. And we also want to have a little bit of a Hudson Valley feel to it. So for instance, our woods are full of locusts, which are invasive, but just full of locusts. And so we're not going to eradicate every single locust that's in there. They were part of the Grassmere Estate. They're really, they were part of the cemetery originally, as there was an alley on Mill Road. There's an alley on the other side of the road by the old cemetery. So that's a good example of something that we're trying to minimize, but we're trying to also keep some things. That's also true for, say, like daffodils. We would like to plant some daffodils in around especially the entrance parts of where kind of the conventional part meets the natural burial ground. So those are just some examples, but yeah. And then in the non-burial areas, we can do other kinds of conservation work that we can't do because in the burial areas, again, we're digging graves, and so there's disruption happening, and we're trying to get rid of the stiltgrass like everybody else by but I mean, like, we're never going to get rid of all the stiltgrass. I know we're not, and we're digging up barberry, but we're probably never going to get rid of all the barberry either. Like, so. It's just an evolving landscape, and we're just trying to fight it back. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Suzanne. I hate to end it on the invasive
Yeah, I know,
species.
really, yeah. Okay.
But here we are. And I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your passion for this with the group. And we really look forward to seeing this grow in the Hudson Valley. Thank you so much. And I just wanted to mention our next morning coffee series speaker. The title will be How Healthy is Your Yard? Simple Actions to Bring It to Life with Zoe Evans and Bram Gunther. And that will be on November 4th at 8:30 a.m. So mark your calendars, and we'll be sending out an invite for that as well very shortly. And we will, we recorded the session, and we will follow up with the recording and the links that we mentioned to HK's work as well. So thank you, everyone, for coming. Have a wonderful day. Thanks, Suzanne.
Thank you. Take care.